Hello and welcome to the wrap-up and review for human sexuality. This is going to be a real quick review. I'm going to go through basically everything we covered in the semester as an overview. I'm not going to go into anything in detail. I'm going to go through just basically everything. Stay tuned at the end. Watch it all the way to the end for an announcement about the final. So at the beginning of the semester, we defined what human sexuality is, looked at human sexuality in general as a whole, and then started with the evolutionary side. So we started with Buss's book. So we looked at first defining what is evolution by natural selection, and then we used that evolutionary theory to look at in-depth more of things regarding human sexuality. That's where things like sexual selection came in, and sexual selection, how that drives preferences, how that drives behaviors. So we looked first at women's long-term mating strategies, and we looked at the various different mating strategies that women have for seeking out a long-term mate. Then we moved on to men's long-term mating strategies. First of all, looking at why would men engage in long-term mating strategies if from evolutionary perspective it is not as beneficial, at least on the surface. But when you look at it more in depth, you realize that men engaging in long-term mating strategies, because that's what women are looking for, means that they would get more mating opportunities. Then we looked at short-term mating strategies for both men and women, both the costs and the benefits of engaging in short-term mating, of engaging in either one-night stands or engaging in infidelity, where you're having short-term mating with one person while being in a long-term relationship with another. And these listed out, if you remember at the end of the first half, I listed these and how this is a very good example, or it exemplifies why mating strategies are the way they are, how women are displaying beauty, and on the next slide you'll see men will seek beauty. Women seek resource providers. Men display resource or become resource providers. Women seek commitment. Men show signs of commitment. Women seek signs of health. Men show signs of health. Women seek signs of parental investment. Men display things that would be indicative of parental investment. And then for short-term mating, women seek out dominance and masculinity. So men who are interested in short-term mating display dominance and masculinity. And then also seek resources in exchange for mating, women do, and men will give resources in exchange. So this is the other side of that coin. There's a few things added here that weren't on the previous one, like the nice guy strategy, in order to try and sneak those mating opportunities type of thing. But it basically coincides with female and male mating strategies work hand in hand. We then talked about STIs, the different STIs, and some ways to prevent them. We talked about sexual physiology. First we looked at the external genitals of females. Then we looked at the internal genitals of females. After that, we looked at the external genitals of males and the internal genitals of males. So basically here we're looking at how basically there's an overlap in structures between men and women, just they differentiated due to the presence of the Y chromosome. So we looked first in this second half at hormones and development. So it's kind of an extension or a continuation of the physical side of the different internal and external organs, but taking that aside of how do these develop and how do hormones relate to them. So we looked at, again, those internal and external organs, but we looked at them in what is going on with hormones. So how the gonads, the testes, or the ovaries are producing the ovum and the sperm, and they are secreting hormones. So this is what was important for this side. So I would know that, again, the SRY gene, know that that is what results in testes, otherwise ovaries, but also that the gonads are what's producing the hormones or secreting the hormones. Specifically in males, how gonads become testes and produce androgens as well as Müllerian inhibiting substance. And in females, the gonads become the ovaries and produce estrogen. We looked at the different systems that were present, the Müllerian system in females, the Wolffian system in males, and how the Müllerian inhibiting hormone released by the testes is what basically drives a defeminizing effect, and then the testosterone, also released by the testes, produces a masculinizing effect. Then we looked at some of the dysfunctions. I would know the basics of the dysfunctions that you see here. You don't have to go too much into detail, but I could ask something as simple as all of these are sexual developmental dysfunctions except, and then have a list. But I could also ask what is going on with Turner syndrome, or what is going on with Klinefelter's. So in that way, I would know the basics of each of these disorders, but also be able to recognize the different disorders if given a list. After that, we looked at sexuality throughout the lifespan. I would know the basics of what's going on here, what's going on before birth, then in early childhood years into school age years, finishing with puberty, and looking at what delayed puberty looks like in boys and girls, the differences there, as well as sexual maturation. We looked at the specific hormones. I would know some basic details of each of these that we talked about in the slides. We talked about the menstrual cycle, the different phases of the menstrual cycle, and I would know what's going on there, as well as specifically what's going on with hormones. So if you remember, there was a nice graph of the hormones and how there's spikes and drops at certain times. That's a good thing for me to ask. Well, what is a good starter for a specific phase, and that is relating to hormones, and that is maybe it's a drop in progesterone, that type of thing. We looked at contraceptives in basically in detail, but in passing. So again, looking at, I would know here basically the different types of contraceptives we talked about, and with the hormonal contraceptives, what is going on with them, what hormones is there, and what it's actually doing to the body to make it so that the body doesn't get pregnant. We talked about menopause in brief. I just know the basics of it. Then we talked about the different options for sexual expression. Again, this is a good thing for me to do as all of these were options for sexual expression except, so I would be able to identify them if given a list. We talked about some of the variant sexual behavior, and actually later on we went into these in much more detail, so I would know details about each of these that we did go into detail about. We looked at the different stages of human sexual response, so I would know those stages, know what's going on in each of the stages. We talked about Kaplan's model as well. I would know the stages of Kaplan's model. We looked at different sexual dysfunctions and specifically how male and female ones parallel each other. I would know the basics of each of these dysfunctions, be able to identify them. If I give a story example and say someone's suffering from such and such, be able to identify what disorder they may have. We then transitioned into sexual harassment, looking at what it was, so I would know the basics of it, of what goes on with sexual harassment. Then we got into the stay-at-home part. We transitioned into things like sexual assault. For this, I would know what is sexual assault, what is rape, know the different levels of sexual assault. Again, these are levels in Canada, but they're still paralleled in a lot of research. So know the different levels, what goes into the different levels. Know the different types of sexual assault that we talked about. So we talked about each of these in detail. And one of the main things I would know is that this acquaintance sexual assault or date rape is the most common by far. We also looked at evolutionary side of sexual assault, and so first we looked at potential byproducts of which rape may be. Then we looked at rape as a adaptation, looking at how pregnancies do occur, things like that. So again, I would know the basics of that. Then we transitioned into loving relationships as well as sexual orientation and gender identity. So for the love, I would know the different types of love we talked about, so the different styles of love. I'd know the basics of each of these. Again, it's a good one for me to say all of these are types of love except, but it's also I could say give a scenario and say what style of love is this person feeling. So either of them are possible. So at least know the overview of each of them. That gets us into the triangular theory of love. And with the triangular theory of love, I would know the basics of the different categories as well as the three components that went into it: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Then we talked about Rustbelt's model, so I would know the basics of Rustbelt's model. Again, I like Rustbelt's model from when I was lecturing about it, so it's likely to be a question, or at least a question relating to it, and what is exactly going on with this model. When is commitment found to be the strongest? When do we say that people are likely to break up? That type of thing. We looked at the stages of relationships, starting with romance, going to power struggle, stability, commitment. Again, I'd know the basics of each of these stages. We had this nice graph saying how much marriage has changed. Again, I'm not going to ask here percentages. I'm not going to say, okay, well, what percentage changed, or what percent is it now compared to before? That's absurd. I'm not going to ask something that pedantic. I may ask things like what has changed today compared to the past, and one of the options might be that less people are getting married, or people are waiting to get married, or people are waiting to have kids. Things like that are things I would ask, not actual percentages. So for this slide, I would know the basics of what is changing, not necessarily what percentages have changed. I know the basics of jealousy. So we talked about jealousy, even though I cut some of it this year, I still talked about the basics of jealousy, so I would know at least the basics there of what's going on. I cut some of the communication stuff, but I would at least know some of the basics of communication. Then we talked about sexual orientation and atypical behavior. Talked about the different orientations to include asexual to this. So again, I'd know the basics there. Sex and gender, know the difference between biological sex and gender, as well as gender roles and gender stereotypes. Then we talked about androgyny. What is androgyny? And that thing we talked about, how each successive generation is becoming more androgynous. We looked at conception. So I just know the basics, what's here on the slide. That's the union of the ovum and the sperm that forms a zygote. We then looked at the prenatal environment, also known as the mother's womb. Here again, I'd know the basics. And this is the basics I'm talking about. I would know the stages, the germinal, embryonic, fetal stage. You don't necessarily need to know the dates, but I would know them in order. So I might ask this, like, what order are the prenatal stages? We talked about teratogens in brief. I didn't go into them in too much detail, but I still could ask a question on the exam relating to them. Talked about the critical periods, so I would at least know what the critical period is. You don't need to know the exact dates for critical periods for each system. This is more of talking about, okay, well, what is a critical period? What is a major critical period versus a minor critical period? That type of thing. And I would know that thing I mentioned a few times about how the majority of critical periods are between 4 and 12 weeks. So when I'm talking dates, that's about all I'd ask. Talked about morning sickness. Why do people have morning sickness? What is it related to? That type of thing. We then talked about the gender of an offspring and how it's actually determined by more than just the sperm. Yes, it's initially determined by the sperm, but how the mother's body has some say in the gender of the offspring. Talked about the perinatal environment, the environment surrounding birth, and we talked about modern day birthing practices, as well as the 3 stages of birth. I don't have that on these slides, but know at least the 3 stages of birth and what is going on with them. We looked at C-section in brief, so I'd know the basics of it, nothing more than the basics. After that, we looked at the neonatal environment, which is the first few months after birth, looking at ideas about parenting and infant care. I cut most of this out, but there are still some things that we talked about, like oxytocin and how oxytocin forms a bond between the parent and the offspring. As well as maternity leave, we talked about that in brief. I would at least know a little bit about that. Then we talked about things more relevant like baby blues, and I would know the difference between baby blues and what's on the next slide, which is postpartum depression, knowing the difference between baby blues and postpartum depression and being able to differentiate them if I give you a scenario saying such and such has been depressed for a week, or such and such has been depressed for 2 months after giving birth. Know, given those 2 scenarios, which one I'm talking about. I'd give more details than that, but that's the basics of it. We talked about the basics of family structure and looking at that and looking at how that goes into shaping a lot of the post-birth things. Again, I cut most of this, so it's not something you have to know too much about, but know the basics. Already talked about this. Then finally, we talked about things like atypical behaviors, so unusual sexual behaviors or preferences for non-genital sexual outlets, which has this list here. This list we already talked about once, but again, I would know the details of what's on this list. I would know each of these in detail from what we covered in class, because I can ask 3, 4, 5 questions just from this list alone. We looked at gender dysphoria, what is gender dysphoria, and also how it's not a disorder unless it causes distress or impairment. You'd know the basics there. And we finished up with sexual ethics. There isn't much to look at here, but I would know things like what is sexual ethics, knowing things like the absurdity of having a vote on whether women are human or not, what is legal in some places or even most places and what is illegal in most places. This is a good list, not for me to ask specifics, but for me to say all of these are illegal in most places except, or all of these are legal in some places except, that type of thing. We talked about taboos and their morality, looking at things, where the taboos are. We also looked at some specific places where there's exceptions or where they're different. The taboos are different, so how taboos and their morality are very culturally dependent. Then we looked at 3 different types of laws. Laws with concern with the preservation of public sensibilities, laws concerned with the protection of a person, and laws maintaining sexual morality. I'd know the basics of each of these three and what differentiates each of them. Then we looked at these two contrasting basic views of sexual morality. And essentially what I'm looking at here is, I'm not likely to ask a question about this. I'm kind of just finishing up with this about looking at these two different views and how views have changed over time, yet there are still some people who haven't changed as fast as others. This gets us to just wrapping up. Sexuality is more than just intercourse. So we've talked about sexuality throughout the course. This course was human sexuality. But when we look at it, we need to know that sexuality is more than just intercourse. Yes, it is intercourse, but it's also thoughts, feelings, and behaviors associated with being male or female. It's experiencing attraction. It's being in love. It's orientation of what drives our sexual desire or what causes sexual arousal. It's being in relationships, it's sexual intimacy, it's activity, it's all of these things that we've talked about this semester. And that is everything. So I hope you enjoyed the semester. I really enjoyed teaching this class. So let me get to talking about the final. So I understand that there's been challenges when you originally signed up for this class. It wasn't an online class, and then I was teaching it online. There's been a few times throughout the semester where things have been delayed. Some of these later lectures, the audio isn't the greatest because it's from a past semester, and I just adopted it and made it for this semester. So there's been challenges, there's been difficulties. So what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to cancel the final. I have enough information from your thought papers, from your previous exams, to get a good idea of the grade that you deserve. And for just about all of you, the final wouldn't affect your grade any. If anything, it might lower your grade. However, if you feel that the final might have raised your grade and you were looking forward to that as part of being able to raise your grade, send me an email and I'll look at the math and see what it would have looked like. But I think for the rest of you, or for all of you, you'll be able to take this extra time and study for your other exams. Again, thank you for the patience that you've had with me this semester, and thank you for taking the class. Again, I love teaching this subject. Thanks.